I trust you all enjoyed that Emmy Award-winning production. And I'm sure that every one of you can relate to the sentiments that were expressed all through that movie. The frustration, the joy of getting something achieved, the sleepless nights, et cetera, et cetera. But talking about the practice school, of course, there are some hard experiences that one experiences in the practice school, and you can learn from these. And that's what the next panel will all be about. And I'd like to invite Horacio Valerius, who will be moderating the discussion, to join me and the group. But first, let me introduce you. You can come up here. Yeah, okay. Horacio received his Bachelor of Science degree from Virginia Tech before attending the practice school. He completed stations at Brookhaven National Lab. I was your director, right?
You were.
Yeah.
You and Bart Richards.
Yeah, good. And you survived.
I survived.
And at Bethlehem Steel. And after graduation, he served as assistant director at the Bethlehem Steel station. Following this, he received his MBA from the UC Berkeley. And since then, he's had nearly 30 years of experience in investment management, holding senior positions at Morgan Stanley and Allianz Global Investors. He is currently president and principal at HAV Capital. Were you assistant director with me? No. No, I didn't think so.
Huff.
Yeah.
George Huff.
You're George Huff, but you're a student with me. That's good. And I'm really pleased to be here today. You flew yourself up here, did you?
I did.
Yes. If he ever gives up his other jobs, he can also go into being a commercial pilot and the like. So I welcome you, Horacio. Please join me, and maybe we can ask your panel to join you as well. Thank you.
Come on up. Thank you, Alan, and thank you all for being here and for listening to our panel about some of the experiences that we've lived through. We've all lived through in practice school. We are fortunate today to have Brian Gorin and Mariah Mant as our esteemed panel. Brian was in practice school in 1987. And he was also an undergraduate at MIT. He went straight from undergraduate to the practice school. He participated in stations at GE and at Dow Chemicals. And after his practice school experience, he decided that was too exciting. So he decided to get an MBA at Columbia University. And for the past 25 years, he's been a strategy and economics consultant with specialty in oil and gas, obviously in healthcare, and in chemicals and automotive industries. And Brian today leads large, complex engagements in antitrust matters, healthcare strategy, as part of as being a managing principal at the Analysis Group. Mariah Mant is a graduate of practice school in 2012. Mariah was an undergraduate at MIT, then went to work in industry before coming back to do the practice school. And she participated in stations at Novartis and at Cabot Corporation. And today, she's a process engineer with Shell, and she works on rotation, 1 month off, 1 month off, at the Majnoon oil fields in Iraq. So practice school totally prepared her for that. In addition to that, she supervises 8 Iraqi engineers while she's on station. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to kick off with Mariah, and I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit, just to set the stage, of what life in Iraq is like and what the Majnoon oil field stands for, because I think it's an interesting name.
I currently work in the southern part of Iraq, so I'm about 1 day's drive from ISIS. And I work near the Iranian border. So Majnoon in Arabic means crazy, because it is the old minefield between the Iraq and Iran war back in the 1980s. So I can't step off any paths or else I'll blow myself up. But we do a bunch of drilling in that area, in that location. But yeah, it's a desert, middle of nowhere. I spend 1 month in that area, and then I get 1 month off. So my husband likes it. I get 6 months off a year.
And how did the decision out of practice school to do this, did practice school influence how you ended
Absolutely.
up in Iraq?
Yeah, so I worked in industry before, but not really, and I would say hardcore technical chemical engineering. And to be honest, once I started working there, I was like, well, I actually really want to do what I studied. Because that's why I came back for a master's. I wanted to learn more to be able to switch into an industry that really valued and used those skills that I learned. And so to be fair, that was exactly what I was looking for. And so what Kishore was mentioning earlier, which I loved, I almost use Perry's at least once a week in my current job in Iraq. So very good to get back to the basics and use that every day.
Thanks, Mariah. Brian, you followed a very different career path. We obviously drove you out of chemical engineering. Can you go through what the thinking was in going from practice school to eventually your MBA and the industry you're in now?
Well, I could try. It certainly probably wasn't the path I anticipated when I first went off to practice school, and I love studying chemical engineering at MIT. I thoroughly enjoyed the practice school experience. I would say probably one of the most important takeaways for me in practice school was I probably wanted something that was a little bit different and was going to get me closer to management-related problems sooner in my career. So I interviewed to join what was then Booz Allen Hamilton, and I wound up working for, really 12 years before I moved to my current company. And I spent most of the time in the energy, chemicals, and pharmaceuticals practice. And it was interesting because I found that having the context of both the engineering education, both the chemical engineering education and a general engineering education, as well as some experience from practice school, was just invaluable when you're doing projects for a global chemical company or a global oil and gas company or a pharmaceutical company, because you can speak the language. And you come in, so often the RAP and strategy consultants, they come in and they don't really know, what you do. They kind of, you ask them, they tell you what to do, and then you give them the same advice back, and suddenly the company listens to it. And it's just bad rap for the industry, by the way. But in general, just having that experience and having the vocabulary just really helped me help my clients over the years.
Okay, thanks. A lot of us, our first hard decision is really whether to go to practice school. I know for many of us in the 80s, it was Jeff Tester who would go around recruiting and trying to get us to sign up. And to this day, my wife, as I was leaving San Diego yesterday, she said, now remind them that the reason that they asked you to be assistant director was because Jeff Tester wanted to win the graduate student faculty basketball game that we used to play in those days. Now, I'm tall, but I'm not a great basketball player. We still didn't win, but she still to this day believes that. Mariah, I'll turn to you. How did you decide that practice school was the right thing for you?
Sure. So no, I did do undergraduate at MIT, but then I went out in industry and I worked for the Lysol company and then for Parsons doing chemical weapons cleanup. And to be fair, I would call it like fluffy engineering, if you know what I mean. It was using a few principles, but it wasn't really getting into what we studied in undergraduate. So that's when I looked at going back for a master's. And so I applied to about 8 or 10 different schools. And I had Professor Smith, who was my undergraduate advisor, and Professor Hatton write the recommendations. And I have to admit, when I got the email and the phone call saying, you got into practice school, my husband popped a champagne bottle and we made a dent in the ceiling. I was like, all right, I'm going back. So really, really excited about that as an opportunity to get more into the chemical engineering principles.
Okay, and Brian?
Yeah, so I'm kind of the classic example of the Jeff Tester tapping on the shoulder. It was the fall of my senior year. I think I actually got a note to come see him. I was horrified. Like, why does Professor Tester want to see me? I wasn't in any of his classes. Again, what did I do wrong? And not that I would have done anything that could have, well, maybe.
Right.
But once in a while you do get in trouble at MIT. But so I went to his office and he said, "Have you thought about practice school?" And the honest answer was no. I really hadn't at that point. He said, "Oh, you should apply." And it was kind of a funny sequence of events following that, because I didn't have to think about it all that long or talk to too many people before I said, well, this is just kind of a great and cool opportunity. So I said, well, you should apply, and here's a copy of the application, and just fill it in and send it in, and it'll be fine. So I said, okay. I started filling out the application. I remember asking him, I said, it asked for GRE scores, and I haven't taken it. Should I go do that? He said, oh, no, I don't think so. I think it'll be fine. I don't care about your GRE scores. And so I filled the application, and I'm blithely ignoring it as I'm going about my fall semester. And then I get another message, come see me, from Professor Testa. Oh, okay, what's this about? So I go in, and he says, oh, so, we talked about those GREs, and it seems the admissions office really needs them. He said, but don't worry, you're in, right? But you need to take them. And this is a Wednesday. I remember this clearly. He said, they need it soon, and they're giving them Saturday. So you can do a late registration, and here's the information. So I remember I ran to the coop because I didn't even know what the sections were. I knew nothing about the test. I just had never thought about it. So that was kind of my first Jeff Tester experience. And it was great. It was great. I mean, at the end of the day, but it was pretty funny. I did great on that test because it just seemed like low pressure, right? You just kind of went in and took it. And
I think he probably reused the note from that he left on my desk.
We did.
Mariah, what? Okay, so never mind. We already got that one. So I want to talk a little bit about experiences that you had that we would consider character building. I don't want to say difficult. I don't want to say, but character building experiences. And we'll start with Brian on this one because I think you have a particularly good story that plays to something we all fear. So maybe we can start there.
Sure. It's funny. This is a story that it comes up at random points in my life, either at a dinner party or something, and usually it's somebody else that instigates it, somebody that knows the story. But the story I tell is about the day my lab partner and I, there were two of us on that particular project, this was at GE Silicones. It was the day we blew up a lab at GE, and it was...
Wait, you blew up the lab. I just want to make sure everybody understands.
We blew up the lab. I mean, it's an exaggeration. We blew up an oven and contaminated a large lab. But, it was one of those, and it's probably worth walking through this, because in some bizarre ways, when we come to this later, there's been a thread in my life that I can tie back to this experience. But we were working on the process of making silanes. So you take silicon, and I don't even remember what it was, but you put some catalyst on the surface, you run, I think it's methylene chloride over it, and you produce silanes. And we're working on some new catalyst ideas that they wanted to test out. So we're running some experiments. And you'd take the silicon, and you would basically grind it up, and it's in a solution of acetone, and you put the other chemicals in, and then you have to evaporate off the acetone before you could actually run the methyl chloride over it. And we had a very clear process. So you had one of those, I forget what they're called, but the thing on the sink where it creates a vacuum and the hose, and so you put the test tube and you put the rubber thing on it, and you turn the sink, it's supposed to create a vacuum and pull a lot of the acetone off. But in the lab we're working in, there was a crack in the attachment, so we couldn't, no matter how much we taped it, it really wasn't getting much of a vacuum. So we're getting a little bit of the acetone off, but not a lot. And the plan was you'd get the acetone mostly off with the vacuum, and then the lab across the hall, which is a much more senior chemist lab and a much larger lab, he had a drying oven that we had permission to use. So my partner and I, we're looking at this thing, and it's kind of sloshing around, and there's visible acetone in this thing, and we're struggling, and I've been accused in my life of saying things with a little too much confidence. So when I really mean a question, people think I'm making a statement with facts behind it. And I remember saying to my partner, Bob Wong, who's a wonderful guy, something like, I think I know. So I think this will be fine. Now, what I really thought Bob was hearing was, that oven's vented, and I don't really know what the capacity of that is, and there's a chance that it'll be venting effectively enough that this won't be a problem. But what do you really think, Bob? Should we do this? But he just heard the, I think it'll be fine, which is fair because that's what I'd said. So we walked across the hall and we put this thing in the oven and closed it and left, and they knew what we were doing. And we're across the hall, and things are fine for the next 10 minutes. And then this alarm's going off. And we're like, I look at Bob, and he looks at me, and he said, "Gee, that's weird." and instantly, we both realized, holy shit, right? This is us, right? So, the building's evacuated, and the the PhD chemist that we were working for was a much more junior guy, and calm as a cucumber. He looked at me and says, "So tell me what happened." Right, and we explained, and he didn't even roll his eyes, which was stunning. I mean, really stunning. And it was, luckily it was brand new. Luckily it was brand new. I don't know if I should say it that way, but it was a new modern oven. It was blast proof, right? So, it created a fire. And they did have to take out the extinguisher and put it out. And of course, when they did that, these chemical extinguishers contaminated everything in the lab, right? So all the work that they were doing in that lab that was exposed was just toast. And Bob and I were sure that we were going to get kicked out of the, like we just didn't think that they were going to let us stick around. I mean, let alone finish. And they did, which was shocking. I mean, actually, I got the diploma somewhere. I could prove it. But yeah, that's kind of my story, and it was a learning experience. We'll leave it at that.
So now we fully understand the business school move.
Yeah. The world is much better off with me without access to chemicals.
So you said there was a thread. Have you kept blowing up ovens as you've gone through life?
No. I luckily I have not blown up any ovens that I'm aware of. You'd think you would know. No, I mean to draw the arc, right? Over the past probably 6 years or so, I'm an economic consultant, and I do a lot of work in the litigation arena. And sometimes we extend beyond economics to other sorts of experts. And if you think about major industrial accidents, things like the Deepwater Horizon event, or the San Bruno pipeline explosion, or Fukushima, or those sorts of things, there's invariable litigation around that. And we end up finding for a client some process safety and safety culture experts to testify in some of these trials. And I find myself reflecting back on my own experience through this. And granted, that's a little microcosm relative to what these things are. But what you discover is the underlying threads and types of errors. Mine had material but not catastrophic consequences. There are similar mistakes can in fact have catastrophic consequences. And I often find myself thinking back, if somebody had been standing right next to the oven, could have been really hurt, right? I mean, bad things could have happened, much worse than we lucked out with. But I really have become kind of, within my firm, kind of the local expert on kind of safety culture and safety culture issues. And so that's kind of the thread. And it's a fascinating space, which I won't waste this group's time right now. I'll be happy to chat about it. It's a really, the concept of figuring out what really underlies accidents and incidents, and what can you do to prevent them in the future, is an important topic. There's a lot of great advancements in that space over the past 20, 30 years, but there's a lot of real societal problems around. Our desire to affix blame often distracts us from focusing on, well, what's really the underlying cause of these issues. So I actually think about safety and industrial issues a lot, 30 years later.
Yeah. Well, Mariah, your story is a bit different. It has to do with what we were talking about before about presentations. But you had a particularly strong learning experience, I would say, at Cabot.
Yeah. Well, I didn't blow anything up, to be fair, but...
Congratulations.
Yeah, well, As a side note, though, I did get poison ivy on one of our outings, and they thought it was a reaction to the silica, so they kicked me out of the labs because they thought I was having a reaction to the silica particles, but that was okay. No, so yeah, Cabot on the presentations, biggest learning I had there was really know your audience. Know who's going to show up for that day and who's going to ask you questions. I think the very first presentation we had, in the first before the series of ones and you finish up, it was brutal. It was absolutely brutal. I think they brought in all of the PhDs from Cabot to ask you questions on those particular topics. And it got so bad that we couldn't answer their questions that our project sponsors had to get up and talk for us to explain the issues that were going on. And after that, similar to the documentary that we just watched about the students getting feedback on how the presentation went, all three groups afterwards were just like, oh God, I don't want to volunteer for the next one. So we kept changing over who was going to do the next one and the next one. So we had to practice a lot more, and we ended up having tons of backup slides. Okay, here's the data here, here's a trend here, here's an equation here. So we learned our lesson on really making sure before you show up, do your background, have the right audience, and make sure you're addressing the issues that they're going to ask for.
How does that relate to the communication you have to do day to day in Iraq with 8 Iraqi engineers?
Well, to be fair, when I first showed up in Iraq, the engineers in the team that I work with, they didn't speak English. So you can imagine it was all drawings. That's how we communicated at first. So I was like, you're going to work on this topic, we're going to fix this issue in the plant, and here's how we're going to do this. And so I'd draw it out, But since then, certainly communication with the Iraqis, that's a whole language issue. But on a day-to-day basis, you have different disciplines. So I'm working with maintenance, operations, commercial projects, all different types of people, and being able to talk to what they really care about and that they can focus on and take away to work on is very important for that.
Good. All of us have cultural experiences as we go through our practice school experience. I know for me, and Tom Moe just reminded me of this, but one of the interesting experiences was showing up at Bethlehem Steel in 1983 with a Toyota Tercel. Now, for those of you who were around at the time, you know that the Friday evening entertainment at steel plants at that day was to take a Japanese car and sledgehammer it to death. Fortunately, since the company wasn't doing so well, we had our own building, so we could hide it in the background. We could hide it in the back of the parking lot. But anyways, were there, Mariah, we'll start with you. Were there cultural, lessons that you learned through your practice school experience?
Absolutely. So very similar, I think, to Kishore. I had a very diverse group. There was 8 of us. We had Canadian, Lebanese, Japanese, Indian, German. We had a wide variety. And of course, with that came a wide variety of dietary habits. So we had a budget, obviously for social things, to go eat and things. And that turned out to be the biggest sore point of the entire group. Because you had the vegetarian and then you had the meat lover. And not all restaurants are going to cater to both. And then you also had people who slept in and people who got up early. So who's going to go actually make it up and get up on time? Or who do you have to go ring their doorbell 5 times and make sure they get out of bed? Probably the best one was also just the activities on the weekends. So everyone did social activities as a group to get and bond and enjoy. And some people, for example, had never really been outdoors, gone for a hike before. And then that's example, we ended up running into poison ivy, which was a bad deal. Just having those experiences together and being able to share that time and get people to go do things together they wouldn't normally have done was absolutely fantastic. And that's exactly what I use in my work today. Incredibly international, incredibly diverse group that I work with today.
Mm-hmm. Right?
Well, so if I think about cultural diversity at practice school, it was a somewhat diverse group, some Asians and some and whatnot, but relative to my undergrad experience and relative to my life experience afterwards, it was really a male white group mostly, right? It was just, so it wasn't a lot of cultural distinction in the typical way you think about it. It was just, and I think it's just coincidental because, I don't think it was at all true of the practice school in general in the late 80s, but it was just that particular group. But there was a diversity of backgrounds, right? There were a handful, 4 of us that were MIT undergrads, the rest were not. They came from different places, and I guess the cultural observation I made is I learned, kind of what not to do if you're an Ivy League grad hanging out in a bar somewhere in northern Michigan. It was one of these social outings. And in Midland, there's not a lot to do there. I don't remember what town we drove to, but it was a good drive to get to a decent bar and nightclub to kind of hang out. And I won't name the name, but one of our group mates happened to be a Yale undergrad. Got a little drunk. Actually, got very drunk, and he was really, and he could be a little annoying. I have to say, like of the group, like you'd like to think, oh, everybody, like he was, the little tension there.
Self-assured, like you were as well.
Yeah, well, he was quite self-assured, right? In fact, it's possible that in his mind I was him, right? I don't know, and I could live with that if it were the case. But he decided to get in the face of some locals. And I don't remember what it was, but I just remember that we were, we meaning two or three of us were trying to kind of get him to back off, and it just wasn't really working. We were pretty sure he was about to get into a fight, right? And he wasn't a very big guy, right? This is not, so he was, like I said, he was very drunk because the guys he was giving a hard time to were, between 6 and 6'3" and 220, and he was maybe 5'10", 145, right? Sort of thing. So it wasn't. And you think with a Yale education he could do that math, but whatever. And my strongest memory as we finally decided we had to leave the bar was, and it was kind of as we were pulling him out, he said, he was very proud of his Yale ring. He raised, he says, as we're pulling him out, he says, you guys, you'd never get one of these around here. I'm like thinking, okay, so it was an experience for me. I just never seen that. Like it was just, maybe it's because I'm MIT undergrad, like we didn't really party as much, but I just, or at least not with other people.
Well, you. And you spent more time doing math.
What?
And you spent more time doing math.
No, we all worked out the math on sort of where it was going to go if we didn't get him out. It was pretty obvious.
Yeah.
It was a fun experience, actually. He was a good guy.
Okay, good. So, for both of you, and we'll start with Mariah. If you were Jeff Tester today, and you were sitting in front of a student trying to convince him to go to practice school, what would you say to them? What are the adjectives that you would use to describe it? What would you tell them that they'll take away from it? Those kinds of things.
No sleep. To be fair, no. In looking back at the professional career that I've had now so far, it's the hardest thing you'll do, but then you know where to go for everything else in the future. And that's the funny part. Even Professor Smith, he'll laugh, but I still call him up if I have questions on one of the Wells issues we have. Still bouncing ideas off of him for being able to estimate two-phase equilibrium, settling out between oil and gas and things. And so, to be fair, it's the best resource you can do for your professional career of using where to go and how to solve things better. So do you need a full model and simulation for that, or do you need a rough estimation on the back of the envelope? What's the best way to approach that? And that gave me that great feeling to be able to do that. Which approach should I use? So it gives you the best resource and background going forward in the future. Absolutely.
And would you recommend they do it right after school, or do you think they should go?
To be honest, yeah, I'm not going to lie. I came back after working for 2 years, and I found it a little bit harder to come back after having time off from MIT and working hard, and then enjoying, earning a living, having your weekends, and then coming back to graduate school. So definitely encourage them right after finishing undergrad.
Okay, and Brian, the same question.
Yeah. Well, by the way, because I went to strategy consulting afterwards, I didn't get my weekends for years after. So maybe I should have rethought this. But no, what would I tell somebody? I think the word I'd probably use is self-discovery, right? It was challenging. It was interesting. It was different. But if I really reflect back on what did I get out of practice school. It's not how not to blow up a lab. I learned a lot about particularly my communication style and how to communicate ideas in a group and how to work with a group. And if I think about some of the things that I've really spent my entire life working on to improve in terms of the way I work with teams, the way I communicate, the way, particularly as a leader, as I've gotten more senior. My first understanding of what those challenges were going to be for me, they started there, right? Nobody could have convinced me going in that that's what I was going to learn, and it was probably years after, maybe even a decade after, before I really figured out that that's when I had that initial realization. But that's what I would kind of tell people. You're going to learn things about yourself that are going to be important to matter to you, 10, 20, 30 years in the future in ways that you can't anticipate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a little bit out of the box thinking. If you were giving advice to Alan about what they should do, with your varied experiences, what they should think about for practice school for the future, what kind of advice would you give them? We'll start with Mariah.
Geez. Well, I think I'll probably mention, going back to earlier panel, when Leanne Kishore talked about it, nowadays you have so many more options, if that makes sense. There's so many different industries you can go into. And even in myself, this is my third full-time employer that I'm with, and I've done anything from consumer products, working on bathroom cleaners, to cleaning up chemical weapons in the environment, to now I'm bringing oil and gas out of the ground in Iraq. So I've got incredible diversity of things that you can work in. And having the variety of those experiences in practice school instead of maybe in more traditional ones really would be a great way to show and get people to try out different things. And that's probably the best thing. I'm very involved in recruiting now with Shell. And one of the things we very commonly see with MIT students especially is they'll keep trying different internships because they want to keep trying different things. There's so many things to do. They want to use an internship or a summer experience or practice school to find out what do I really like, or to be honest, what I don't like. You can have a short experience and 2 months over, it's done. No skin off my back for that. So that's one of the things that I'd really encourage is getting more of the variety of things to help people figure out what they enjoy, given there's so many more options now.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and when you posed it to me earlier, it's something I hadn't thought about, and the thing that comes to mind both ties back to my own experience, in fact, it goes back to that lab experience. And I don't know how practical it is or isn't, but one of the things that I think about both in my client work around some of the safety stuff I do, but also my management roles within my firm are, low probability, high impact events, or the term I like to use is tail risk. Think about a distribution, and there's no area in the world where, or in the human mind, where we fail so miserably, I think, as humans do in assessing risk, right? Where particularly low probability things, right? It's just very hard to conceptualize, very hard to wrap your brain around what's the right cost-benefit trade-off. And the longer you're in an area, well, there's, and as I said before, there's tremendous work and thought and effort that goes into this space, but blind spots develop. Right? I mean, the financial crisis is a great example, right? It was a low probability but high impact event that nobody built into the models, right? And so I wonder if, and maybe this has happened and I'm just unaware of it, but it'd be great to see at least some projects at practice school with some of these, minds that are a little less jaded by experience, to think about these sorts of questions, right? I think the impact on society would be huge. I think where it gets tricky, I mean, you use the comment in the documentary, right? Engineers turn, ideas into dollars. These are ideas that they do turn into dollars, but it's very hard to measure those dollars, right? It's how many disasters did we avoid by having a good process in place? Well, you don't know, right? How many disasters? You know what it costs when you have one, right? But you don't know what the likelihood was, or how many you missed. So I'd love to see students and brains like the practice school has, once in a while thinking about those questions. Mm-hmm.
I think for all of us, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but practice school was highly influential in our lives. Not only, at least in my case, my first job on Wall Street actually came through a practice school contact, which was interesting to begin with. But he went on to be a chemicals analyst, which made more sense. I became something else. But How do you, looking back and just as a summary to wrap up, how do you think about, having a few years behind? How do you think about your practice school experience now? Is this something you would tell your kids they have to do if they wanted to be an engineer? Is this something that really you believe shaped your lives? Mariah.
For me, absolutely. It got me into the oil and gas industry. This helped me transition from, as I mentioned previously, things that are not as maybe technically detailed or complex before. So this was a great way for me to springboard into something and go in with that confidence and background knowledge and experience to go into that industry now and really enjoy the challenges that I have and feel confident in approaching and solving issues that we had. As an example, last week I just flew in from Iraq on Thursday, so I've spent the last 4 weeks there. Just 2 weeks ago, we sucked in our firewater tank because they, so we vacuum pulled it because they estimated the wrong. They said, oh, a 6-inch vent size should be fine, no problem. They didn't realize it was blocked with mud and water. So when they pumped it out, shoop, there went the roof. And so you talk about like risk analysis and every day talking about that, but being able to, okay, I know the tools, this is what we have to do, this is how to change this, do the estimation, what size do you really need, how do we change the procedures, all the different things and confidence to go forward to fix those. Absolutely, the practice school gives me that, that background and that knowledge to be able to do that. So every day, and as you mentioned, textbooks, I bring over how many different textbooks to Iraq. I mean, my desk is shoop, and use those for doing that. So it gives you the experience to do that. So for me, absolutely, very good experience for what I do every day now.
And Brian?
Yeah, so, it's funny. I was reflecting on something Leah said in the first panel where she talked about just the myriad of opportunities that are available to chemical engineers in general, and I think that's true. And I was kind of connecting that with a point of view that I've had for a long time, which is that life's a random walk. Right, at any moment, we're looking at the choices, and we're all hopefully careful and work hard to make good decisions. And but once you choose a path, we're all naive to think that what's going to hit us on that path are things that we've really done a good job of anticipating. And I think if you embrace that and recognize that you need to be thoughtful about your choices, but be prepared for whatever comes, that's the way I try to kind of progress through my life and my career. So to connect that back to practice school, I couldn't recommend it to anybody more strongly, right? As I said, there are threads there that have influenced and impacted me tremendously, none of which I could have anticipated, right? So I made an active choice, that when Jeff Tester said, "Hey, give this a shot," I said, "Okay, I'll give this a shot." And then it led me places that I wouldn't otherwise be. I'm sure I wouldn't be sitting here. Well, no, he certainly wouldn't.
You certainly wouldn't be
sitting here. But in this state of my career, right? I don't think I don't think I would have had the same path that I have. You're right. I probably wouldn't be invited. So I'd encourage people to do it, not because of what it's going to give you, but because of the directions it's going to take you and that you can't anticipate. I think it's done that for me. I think it's done that for many people I've talked to.
Yeah. Well, with that, we'd like to please help me thank Mariah and Brian. We'd like to wrap up. But thank you so much for your comments.